Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the first Obenhaus lecture of the 2025-26 academic year. Every year we offer one or two Obenhaus lectures, which give our PhD students an opportunity to share their research with the community. This is a really exciting time for all of us to hear from them. So we are excited today to have Cornelius Shaw with us.
I want to echo Dean Vought's welcome. I'm Rachel Mikva. I do a number of things here at CTS. Currently relevant to this program is I direct our PhD program. And I just want to mention for one moment a little of the background for the Obenhaus lecture. Victor Obenhaus was a professor of Christian ethics here at CTS from 1944 until 1973, and he actually also served as acting president of the seminary for a year after that. He wrote a number of books on religion, including Hebrew Prophets and American Conscience, The Responsible Christian, Church and Faith in Mid-America, Ethics for an Industrial Age. And then, in addition to his academic work, Dr. Obenhaus was active in ecumenical affairs with the National Council of Churches and worked to revitalize rural churches. Following his retirement, he then worked on behalf of prison inmates as head of the Illinois Prisons and Jails Project. So to honor this broad and deep intellect and the kind of scholar that touches both that really excels in both academic work and in the ways that it touches our very real world, we have these lectures. So I'm going to ask Cornelius Shaw's advisor, Dr. Bo-Myung So, to introduce our speaker today and the talk. Dr. So?
Yes, my name is Bo-Myung So, professor of theology and cultural criticism at CTS. I am pleased to introduce you to this year's Obenhaus lecture presenter, Cornelius Shaw. The title of his lecture is Dark Night of the Soul, Lessons from a Psalmist and Two Saints. It gives me a special sense of joy and privilege to introduce Cornelius Shaw for this occasion, because I serve as his academic advisor and have given this lecture as a student more than a generation ago. Cornelius Shaw is an emerging expert in the field of science and religion. His dissertation research seeks to navigate the complex intersection of scientific facts, religious beliefs, and cultural traditions. This afternoon, he will present a fresh framework for understanding the influences, showing how a deeper awareness of each can help us face the profound challenges of our modern world. Drawing from his own experience in pain, faith, and consciousness, Cornelius's lecture will help us to find courage in the shadows and to find meaning in the mystery of suffering. Please join me in welcoming Cornelius Shaw.
Oh, okay.
So do I just stand in?
Yeah, okay, whatever you want.
Hello, everyone. The first thing I want to do is dedicate this lecture to the loving memory of my grandmothers, Willa Abrams and Alfreda Shaw. Okay. I want to thank everyone for being here. It is my privilege to be presenting live before the committee, faculty, students, and friends of the seminary. The Obenhaus lecture is an opportunity to share with you my area of research, which focuses on the intersection of science, religion, and culture. It is my hope that this address previews the work that has occupied my time and my energy over the last several years at CTS. As the title of my speech indicates, I plan to talk briefly about the dark night of the soul, a topic which has enriched my interior life ever since studying it in Dr. Stone's 2023 class, Suffering, Lament, and Human Existence in the Hebrew Bible. Today's lesson began as a final paper I wrote in 2023 on the Book of Psalms and the lost art of lament tradition. The research introduced me to scholars like Walter Brueggemann, Gerald May, and Brickman and Campbell, who have all contributed to my thinking. The paper itself is an exegesis of Psalm 88, a unique scripture that hurls accusations at God. My attempt to connect the paper to my dissertation research came much later in my journey, as more recently, I have been reflecting theologically on the higher mysteries that science and religion both touch on, but that neither can fully explain alone. Some of those mysteries include creation and the beginning of the universe, consciousness and the mind, and the problem of evil. For our lesson, we will look at different theories and traditions to unpack the age-old enigma of suffering, the dark night of the soul. In this Obenhaus lecture, I will be covering 3 objectives about the dark night and its relevance for you today. First, we will identify some pathological distinctions between clinical depression and the dark night. This helps us to establish one as a treatable disease and the other as a transformative process. Second, we will look at some key dark night sufferers throughout history, including Mother Teresa, St. John of the Cross, and Heman the Ezrahite. Exploring their stories will transport us from modern times to medieval Europe, to ancient Israel, and back again. Third, we will review biblical criticisms of Psalm 88, and then conclude with my own personal story.
You want to see the camera with audio? We can turn.
They can't see me.
If you speak, the camera might turn towards you.
Because most of you have endured difficult life challenges, I invite you to reflect on those experiences while listening to my talk. I do not use visual aids to illustrate the presentation, so during my speech, please feel free to pull out your devices and Google images of the authors, ancient sacred texts, and historical figures who will soon become central to our discussion. You might also want to take notes and write down questions for later, as we will be going in depth. Those who wish to read the full version of the paper may contact me for a copy at my student email. The dark night of the soul is neither a scientific fact nor a religious belief. The truth of it lies somewhere in the middle. The concept originates from 16th century Catholic mysticism. The term gets used in secular context to describe any painful, life-changing experience. From a scientific position, the dark night is less of a mental health crisis and more of a psychological reckoning caused by events that result in significant personal growth. From a religious view, the dark night is an unwelcome, divinely initiated process that starts with God's perceived absence and ends in more authentic faith. A precursor to our modern understanding of what the dark night represents can be found within Psalm 88, one of the darkest lamentations in ancient literature. The 88th Psalm has eluded explanation for centuries. This mysterious passage typically puzzles readers and goes ignored by biblical scholars. Still, its starkly human and bleak realism has resonated with countless generations of people experiencing a dark night of the soul. Marked by religious disillusionment and spiritually dry prayer, the dark night signifies a personal faith crisis or a difficult life period. The sudden and extended loss of God's felt presence drapes a curtain over the soul. Many believers feel the sting of divine absence at least once. Many believers feel the sting of divine absence at least once. Heman, the narrator of Psalm 88, exhibits symptoms related to prolonged depression, chronic illness, and societal isolation, in addition to blaming God for those maladies. And his story will frame our discussion. Exegetical research reveals a church that does not know what to do with the 88th Psalm. Its theodicy runs so counter to Judeo-Christian doctrine that biblical scholars question how the text managed to reach canonicity. Walter Brueggemann calls this enigmatic requiem an embarrassment to conventional faith, because it stubbornly refuses to explain the suffering or to vindicate the one who permits it. The narrator is a God-forsaken Job-like figure, writhing in pain, haunted by grim specters, and struggling to reconcile the moral incoherence of divine reckless abandonment. The sinister dynamics at play here elicit an ominous pathos, as his final utterance in Hebrew is simply darkness. What is this antithetical psalm doing in the Bible? To appreciate its place in Scripture, let us consider what experts say about pain, suffering, and consciousness. There are several foundational texts which could be recommended for a more nuanced understanding of the Dark Night syndrome. Some of those books serve as guides to discovering spiritual meaning through difficult times. Other books attempt to describe the Dark Night as a series of psychological stages with increasing levels of intensity. For more on this topic, see books and authors akin to Trials of the Visionary Mind by John Perry, Spiritual Emergency by Groff and Groff, and Personality Shaping Through Positive Disintegration by Kazimierz Dabrowski. Spiritual guru Eckhart Tolle teaches about the transcendence of pain through radical acceptance. He says that the dark night hurts so much because it facilitates the death of the old you and then induces the laborious rebirth of the new. Tolle teaches that to master your emotions, you must become their observer, not their creator. This allows for freedom from the pain body, the part of your ego that feeds on negativity. From a Tollean perspective, the suffering scene in Psalm 88 could be the catalyst that pushes a person toward higher self-awareness and away from an identity built on pain. But precisely what is pain? Why does God allow suffering? These two eternal human questions have inspired philosophers across various cultures, faiths, and eras. How to abide with the sacred and the supernatural as we endure the mundane and empirical limits of our corporeality has been a thorn in humanity's flesh since time immemorial. Still, I believe humans have a glorious communal destiny, not to reign as the crown of apex predators consuming the globe, but to serve as the intelligent protective stewards for all living creatures. Earth's fecundity and its interdependent ecosystems are what sets our pale blue dot apart as the most precious planet in the observable universe. For Earthlings, pain is a survival mechanism that alerts the nervous system to danger, and suffering describes its harmful effects. Fundamentally, pain is inevitable, and unlike many aspects of human existence, suffering does not discriminate. Physical pain and emotional suffering are inherent parts of life we cannot ever fully circumvent. Technically, pain and suffering refer to tangible harm that can be legally compensated in court. Let it suffice to say that jurisprudence alone fails to consider the brute fact that pain can outright destroy a person or constructively expand the self. Jurisprudence also fails to embrace the notion that suffering plays a decisive role in the ever-changing sum of a human being. What if we begin to look at pain and suffering as universal, intangible forces that underlie our pursuit of happiness? The human mind is hardwired to minimize stress and maximize desire. Where philosophy seeks meaning in pain and suffering, psychology suggests that our basic urge is to escape pain and suffering entirely. In Sigmund Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, He theorized that the core compulsion behind all your decisions is an instinct to seek immediate gratification and to avoid pain at all costs. These two primal urges motivate your personality, sexuality, beliefs, and actions. It is relevant to interpret Freud's mindset as his thoughts emerged in the throes of terminal disease and morphine dependence. The founder of psychoanalysis underwent 34 maxillofacial surgeries for oral cancer before his subsequent euthanasia in 1939. By then, Freud famously declared that the best we can do to thwart suffering is to transform neurotic misery into common unhappiness. In other words, grappling with existential concerns inherent in the human condition, things like mortality, love, freedom, and futility, lend themselves to general sadness. Getting sad is a normal emotion and certainly an appropriate response to our broken world and to life's unfairness, but usually the feeling passes. According to Brickman and Campbell, happiness, sadness, and the like are transitory states which come and go with zero permanent gains. Their classic hedonic treadmill model purports that short-term gratification is an altogether Sisyphean task. For, despite major positive events or negative life changes, sooner or later, the psyche returns to relatively stable emotional baselines. Jumping off of the treadmill requires mindfulness techniques and other contemplative practices. However, those unable to bounce back from high or low moods end where they began, as if running in place. Clinical depression is a debilitating disorder. Current research links the root cause to a combination of genetic signs, environmental factors, and demographic circumstances. Psychologist Gerald May differentiates between clinical depression and the dark night. Typically, a patient trapped in the icy grip of a bipolar episode is too dysphoric to muster productivity or to appreciate normally enjoyable things. It can render apathetic and lethargic an otherwise sensitive, energetic person, such that one's true self seems to disappear. Concisely, the dark night is a holy depression reported among believers in the Judeo-Christian deity. For night sufferers, daily routines go interrupted, and the Freudian pleasure principles remain intact, but their hedonic treadmill has malfunctioned so much that the soul becomes desensitized to stimulation and no longer derives a modicum of spiritual fulfillment. Thoughts of death do occur here, but it is more attached to escaping the mortal coil than it is morbid self-loathing or suicidal ideation. Sufferers of a dark night craft elaborate rationales which ease them into accepting their fate as part of a mystical grand design. Dr. May's distinctions are important because countless adherents to religious schools of thought eschew clinical treatment and refuse medical diagnoses, presupposing instead that pain, suffering, and vicissitude are compulsory tools of sanctification and the ultimate trials of faith. Can suffering be a test of metal? At times, still. Depression itself is virtually taboo and not always self-evident. Fortunately, no individual is doomed to be sad forever, and while we all have our own battles to fight, some people are stronger than they know. I agree with Dr. May's conclusion that the dark night warrants a unique intervention which psychology alone cannot provide. While essential for mental health, psychology is limited in its capacity to address the spiritual nature of human experience, necessitating a more holistic approach, like turning towards a higher power. But religious affections ebb and flow. Readers witness intimate vacillation among biblical lamenters who brim with liturgical enthusiasm and then pant for refreshment. Hebrew poet and warrior King David is the named author of 73 tragically beautiful lament psalms. At his lowest moments, the monarch pined about tranquil desert oases and metaphorically parched lands. The drought motif, as it stands today, emerges from an age-old Roman Catholic teaching called spiritual dryness, an overwhelming sense of separation from God, accompanied by empty sensations. Its triggers are robust, from external factors like the death of a loved one or job loss, to internal factors such as morbid rumination and a crumbling worldview. Like reuniting with a lost lover, conquering dryness leads to a deeper faith in God and appreciation for divine presence. Some world religions emphasize the role of pain and suffering in character building, while others see pain and suffering as the consequences of actions, a test of faith, or an aspect of the natural order. The first noble truth of Buddhism teaches that existence is suffering, and thus it conveys the singular bond all humans share and come to understand, that everybody, everywhere, suffers. This metaphysic holds that life's only certainties are birth, age, sickness, and death. According to Jamie Sams, Native American tradition recognizes a spirit's black night, which are 4 hard rites of passage that temper the warrior spirit by forcing you to adapt or die trying to survive a mental night of stress, an emotional night of heartache, a physical night of health, and a spiritual night of faith. The Catholic Church anticipates dry spells within faith as characteristic growing pains in the formation of spiritual masters. One who is determined to patiently trust in the Lord without any explanation or relief. One who is pruned by adversity and declines in lesser comforts will grow into a more complete and mature believer. Faith notwithstanding, the dark night can span any indefinite length of time, lasting from weeks and months to years and decades. The most aggravated case on record belongs to Mother Teresa. Born under her real name, Agnes, in North Macedonia in 1910, her family was of Albanian descent. She later became Mary Teresa in 1929 upon taking vows as a nun, choosing the name Mary Teresa to honor Saint Teresa of Lisieux, who suffered her own spiritual darkness until dying prematurely from tuberculosis at age 24. In 1946, after witnessing extreme Hindu-Muslim riots and poverty during the partition of Pakistan and India, Mother Teresa answered a mystical call from Christ to serve the poorest of the poor in Calcutta. By 1950, the Vatican allowed the nun to start her own religious order, called the Missionaries of Charity, a Catholic convent built for the hospice and care of refugees and orphans in the region. Mother Teresa received numerous humanitarian awards, including the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, and she was canonized as a saint in 2016. Her legacy set the standard for global charitable work, and her organizations continue providing critical assistance to the world's most vulnerable populations. Mother Teresa's fame and image was amplified by American media coverage, which cemented her rising status as an international celebrity. However, it was a shocking revelation to the public when the extent of Mother Teresa's 40-year dark night was exposed after her death in 1997. Despite her public persona of joy and light, posthumous letters revealed that she secretly struggled with a self-described inner darkness that lasted from her early ministry in Calcutta until her final days. The living saint wrote privately and often about feeling like Jesus abandoned on the cross. Mother Teresa admitted to her confessors that the place of God in my soul is blank. There is no God in me. If I ever become a saint, I will surely become a saint of darkness. Nevertheless, Mother Teresa came to accept the pain as a divine gift that intensified her solidarity with the poor, who also felt uncared for, unwanted, and unloved. Her ordeal is a case study in the conversation on suffering, demonstrating how spiritual darkness can even impact someone considered the paragon of holiness. But how can a person so close to God feel so utterly alone? This kind of question poses a heavy theological challenge called theodicy. The problem of vindicating God as an omnipotent, benevolent deity in a world of natural disasters, predation, disease, and human evil. The lesson to be learned in Mother Teresa's theodicy is that the darkness can envelop anyone. And in this way, her story is more surprising than it is unique. Many saints and mystics across the centuries have all recognized God's absence as a painful, purifying grace, not a sign of diminishing faith. Some early Catholic doctors of the church influenced Mother Teresa, including the definitive authority on the Dark Night, namely the luminous 16th century Spanish mystic, St. John of the Cross. While Mother Teresa saw herself participating in Christ's suffering, St. John was the first to chart the soul's journey through the dark, lighting a beacon for others to follow. St. John, his work, is a theological and psychological thriller detailing one evening of inner turmoil and hidden truths. Born to a widowed family of Jewish conversos in Spain 1542, Juan de Yepes Alvarez became an ordained Carmelite friar in 1567, shortly before taking the name San Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross, and befriending the fierce reforming visionary Teresa de Avila, another noteworthy night sufferer. The duo, Teresa de Avila and St. John, taught that humans have an inborn longing for completion that cannot be achieved by worldly pleasures. Together, their diligent effort at restoring monastic asceticism to its former austere roots was met with suspicion and betrayal by fellow monks, causing multiple Spanish inquisitions and 2 incarcerations, where St. John wrote prolifically between 1576 and 1577. Thematically, San Juan's prison canticles schematized Thomas Aquinas's rigorous 3 steps to a settled mystical ascent. One of those pieces that he wrote in prison also features homoerotic overtones personifying Christ as secret bridegroom. His poem Noche Oscura del Alma is where the dark night of the soul phrase derives. It also contains same-sex allusions, which are romantically suggestive. In summation, one lonely night, Juan, fired with love's urgent longings, steals away from his jail cell for a nocturnal rendezvous with a mysterious anonymous beau. They awaken together among a field of lilies in the morning. It is hard to imagine that San Juan and his contemporaries were not keenly aware of the explicit scenes in this piece. Of all his poems, Noche sharply poses the question of experiential meaning because of his barefaced vocabulary for human love, which appears to require little, if any, deciphering. Granted, erotic Catholic mysticism is more radical than it is novel. Teresa de Avila's The Interior Castle employs the charged language of courtly love to describe ecstatic acts of spiritual matrimony. Hagewitch of Antwerp's Seventh Vision depicts her own positively orgasmic nuptial reception of the Eucharist. San Juan's lovesick longing for the male Christ is so visceral that it jumps off the page. He escaped from jail in 1578. 6 years later, he wrote a long commentary demystifying the moral crux of the poem, death to self and detachment from the world. According to St. John, the dark night of the soul happens suddenly. It is first perceived during the soul's common active attempt to contact God using spiritual auxiliaries like prayer or worship. At first, God honors this futile act by blessing supplicants with tender mercies like visions, signs, and other ecstasies to ease them into the fold. Inevitably, God weans the spiritual babe off from this sweet nectar and demands the now nourished soul to mortify its carnal nature. During purgation, God is hardly perceived by the individual, and the sheer numbness can last so long that some people abandon their faith altogether. To graduate beyond this purification stage, one must suspend attachment to everything they know and tread the narrow path to enlightenment. Indeed, St. John of the Cross arranged some cryptic texts which can be daunting to read between the lines. Audiences naturally require careful guidance in navigating his mysticism. The barefoot monk himself remains central to modern Discalcid teachings and eremitical lifestyles. Discalcid means barefoot. Still, an unassuming reader undergoing purgation and searching for immediate answers might pause at the double entendres in Noche and depart from it even more bewildered. Someone in crisis mode can hardly afford the time to sit and parse each verse of the Noche poem. Readers seeking fast-acting relief should look no further than the biblical lament genre for a more accessible text specimen that exhibits the classic associated symptoms of a dark night, namely religious disillusionment and spiritual dryness. A lament is the heart's way of articulating the interjection ouch, and of directing morally charged exclamations toward a higher power. Lament activity involves honest, passionate prayer to God, expressing sorrow, grief, or confusion about pain, suffering, and injustice in the world. The spiritual element sets lament activity apart as a unique vessel for catharsis. Lamentation has been a multivocal tool that pain victims and trauma survivors have used since ancient times to process both individual pain and communal suffering. Lamenters typically display attitudes of protest and objection, and nearly half of the Psalms place God squarely under the obligation to meet the demand for mercy and justice. But of the 150 Psalms, there is only one psalmist who forgoes heaping praise on God. Instead, the writer named Heman pushes the spiritual grievance process of lament to its non-doxological zenith in Psalm 88, which is entirely devoid of hope or resolution. Heman is an obscure biblical figure. He appears as a secondary character rather than a major prophet or a king. Scholars reconstruct his life through genealogies and chapter headings. Still, his self-described friendship with darkness shows how the dark night applies regardless of a person's time, location, or personal circumstances. Lamenters usually put a positive spin on their petition to God, but Heman just cries out with nothing good to say. What went so wrong here? According to tradition, Heman, son of Joel, son of Samuel, hailed from the core Levite tribe in southern Judah during the golden age of Israel's United Kingdom era. Classified as chief among three handpicked Levite ministers of music, Heman took after his grandfather Samuel and fell into prophetic trances when music played. Nicknamed the king's seer, this trained musician sired 17 children, and he wore the finest linens and silks. In Psalm 88:15, Heman says that he has been afflicted since his youth. This leads scholars to suspect that he suffered from childhood trauma or some pre-existing condition that periodically prevented him from singing in the temple. As conductor of the Royal Levitical Orchestra, Heman wore two professional hats, playing a role in managing the day-to-day sanctuary duties and setting the atmosphere through scriptural cantillation and sung prayers. For any leader, the expectation to generously donate one's time, talents, and energy can cause even the greatest among us to feel overworked and undervalued. Patriarchs akin to Moses and Elijah teetered on the brink of resignation, not due to weakness or incapacity, but partly because of perfectionist tendencies which only heightened their imposter syndrome and self-doubt. Maybe Heman suffered from a combination of these factors. In either case, to satisfy his psalm with an obligatory praise would undercut the power of lament and would retract from the dim finality, which adds a dash of realism to the Bible that cannot be duplicated and would be sorely missed. The remainder of Psalm 88 places theodicy and doxology in extreme tension. It breaks from the traditional lament to praise formula, arguing through a series of rhetorical questions that God is robbing himself of a great worshiper. Nothing changes by the end. Heman yells in vain at an empty sky. He is nonetheless depressed, and mercy itself has been denied. Rejected by companions and God, the closing line in verse 18 says, "Darkness is my only friend." This leaves audiences with the sense that darkness itself has become the only constant thing in his life. And so we depart from the text with a sobering reminder to be forgiving, as other people are carrying burdens that we will never see. Psalm 88 was effectively written by and for cynics in a love relationship with God. Many contemporary atheists and agnostics remain drawn to its rich insights. Julie Exling sums up her research on the attraction of ex-believers to the Bible as a form of soft emotional atheism, in which a person who resents religion due to abuse or trauma exhibits forms of derision, disbelief, and contempt for the non-existent. Philip Kitcher says that soft atheism reaches for connection in the godless universe where morality and a meaningful life do not depend on a deity. Indeed, the 80th Psalm flirts dangerously close to themes of religious doubt rooted in pain, and thus it serves as a unique referendum for believers and non-believers, but in their respective ways. For believers, the psalm unlocks access to an emotional lexicon that allows one to articulate genuine negative religious feelings. For non-believers, the psalm transcends religious belief in its realistic depiction of chronic pain, untold suffering, and darkness unto death. Beyond those comparisons, the most remarkable fact is that this lament was included at all in the Bible. Its iconic, unresolved ending stands in contrast to other typical biblical narratives of optimism and divine intervention. Whereas Mother Teresa and St. John found empathy and ecstasy on the other side of their suffering, Heman offers no such resolution, presenting instead an unblinking portrait of despair. These three figures, separated by millennia, form an unlikely friendship rooted in their mystical experience of light and shadow. Together, they teach us to search for God, not in the sky, but in ourselves and in the lower aspects of existence. But those are just textbook examples. The truth of a soul being utterly transformed is a concept that can feel abstract until you experience it yourself. While we can study the phenomenon, true comprehension of suffering is apprehended through personal experience. My own dark nights cannot compare to the historical scale of others, but I too have plunged beneath its lonely depths. From my coming out journey to other life challenges, those nights have been the cleansing furnace that forged the person standing before you today. Coming out in my early 20s, which was in many ways a grand liberation, ushered in an unexpected dark night of the soul. After shedding a lifetime of fear and secrets, the euphoria of being accepted gave way to a sense that the carefully constructed world I had known, with its familiar religious traditions and familial expectations, was collapsing around me. As I found healing through community, I began to see my story as one thread in a larger tapestry of friends bound by our experiences. At church, people were polite but distant. Their lukewarm responses and coded rebukes were unspoken rejections, a cacophony of silence, which slowly pushed me from the pulpit to the margins and finally out the door. This crack in my foundation helped me to understand the true cost of that silence months later when tragedy struck our congregation. On a November evening in 2012, service at Abundant Faith Word Church in Kalamazoo, Michigan, came to a halt with the announcement that one conspicuously absent member was discovered lifeless at her home. The sudden, untimely death of our women's minister, Monique Powell, age 35, scandalized the leadership team and sent shockwaves throughout the Church of God in Christ, Southwest Michigan jurisdiction. Her funeral was eerily quiet, and eulogizers never acknowledged her suicide. Looking back, I now see the importance of holding space within faith communities for grief to be expressed rather than suppressed. Reviving the lost art of lament tradition would offer a healthy coping mechanism. However, in my experience, religious folk are not exactly sad people. Most are conditioned to never question God, opting instead for platitudes like, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." How many of us have mistakenly believed that God demands brute strength when it is our weaknesses that keep us running back? In a world distracted by flashing neon signs and increasing uncertainty, cries for help often get drowned out. We have become the subject of a timeless observation: people talking without speaking and people hearing without listening. A similar sense of societal disconnect was captured brilliantly by the famous artist Paul Simon. A similar sense of societal disconnect was captured brilliantly by the famous artist Paul Simon. In The Sound of Silence, Simon and Garfunkel croon the words, "Hello, darkness, my old friend." Their song is a soundtrack to the eroding social fabric of the 1960s, and it speaks to the legacy that Psalm 88 has left behind. I chose this pericope because everyone harbors a shadow self beneath the masked persona they show to the world. It holds relevancy for anyone who has ever mastered the art of faking smiles, and it teaches people of all creeds that they are not alone in the world or in time. Whether through acts of charity, mystical ascent, or honest lamentation, Mother Teresa, St. John, and Heman the Ezrahite remind us of the enduring human search for meaning. Their stories have invited us to recognize the sacred, not just in moments of well-being and clarity, but in the difficult, necessary work of becoming a better person. Mother Teresa used the pain as fuel for her ministry. St. John framed his struggle as a window to mystical unification. Heman the Ezrahite testified that long-suffering can potentially turn a humble believer hostile. Overcoming the psychological effects of it all starts with a choice between the willingness to detach and accept life-changing truths about yourself, or to remain your current version and simply go through the motions of daily life and religiosity. Either way, pain is inevitable to the human condition, and there is only so much that can be done to mitigate the sting. Our modern conveniences do not prevent suffering, and in some cases, they intensify it. The ability to stream entertainment and to connect on social media, for example, does not shield you against boredom or loneliness. And this highlights a perpetual truth. While our physical lives may seem easier than ever, finding meaning in life is no less difficult than it was centuries ago. As we close, remember that the goal is not a life without darkness, but a love so bright that it shines in the dark. That is much easier said than done. All of this is much easier said than done. And it can be a lot to deal with, but you do have to deal with it. The dark night is your path, your destiny. Get angry at it, cry about it, but the more you resist it, the more it consumes you. Raising awareness about the dark night helps us to recognize the early signs, seek help, and hang in there, for it is always darkest before dawn. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cornelius. We have a few minutes for questions if people would like to engage and comments or questions around this very interesting and compelling topic?
Cornelius, thank you so much. Really enjoyed listening to you. Although I had the privilege of seeing the written text before, but it was really gratifying to see you talk, and the confidence with which you spoke to us was really it was good to see that. And I have a general question, and I realized listening to you and reading the text, the text and the content is really experiential and personal. And I was wondering, listening to you, as to the connection, and I can see the potential connection between this text you spent so much time working on and the dissertation research and writing that you've been doing over the last year, 2 years, and going back, before even. So this text that you've been, you've spent some months, working on, and the dissertation research that you've been doing, sometimes side by side. So connect the two for me.
Okay, so this particular paper, it deals with the human element that comes in the science and religion field in terms of aspects that science and religion both touch on, but that neither of them can fully explain without the other. And so in this paper, I wanted to take the psychological angle of the science part in order to sort of pathologize what exactly is the difference between a dark night and something scientific as clinical depression. And it's more of an exercise in melding the two than it is, outright my dissertation. But in putting the paper together, I found all sorts of different connections and topics. Like I could have continued, So yeah.
I have a question for you, Cornelius.
Yes.
So within Jewish tradition, lament has a far more central, recognized, valued place, right? Both from within the biblical tradition and also in rabbinic tradition. Unfortunately, there's been a communal history that has probably necessitated that, but there's even a theological concept around Hester Panim, the idea that God hides, that the divine face either is hidden or feels hidden, and there's theological debate around, whether that's so, or just a perception. But I wanted to flag something that you touch on very briefly when you were talking most directly about your personal experience in the congregation, that is mentioned at least twice in the psalm, as I recall, maybe more. And that is the way, and is very much wrapped into the dysfunction that our society has around people who aren't well, and and that is that the instinct is to abandon them, right? They make us uncomfortable. Um, and I'm, and so that the feeling of the abandonment by God is either precipitated by or magnified by the fact that everybody in their life has abandoned them also. So I'm wondering if your saints or your other interlocutors engage that intersection, because clearly our spiritual loneliness is not an isolated relationship with God. It's bound up with all of our relationships.
Well, yeah. So we can go down the list. So Mother Teresa, for example, um, I think first, I think that her dark night of the soul was triggered by her mystical experience, where she essentially heard God's voice several times, but then not again in their entire life. And so when she would try, she had a few close friends in her life, But she couldn't make human connections really, because she was so sort of preoccupied with this disconnection, where she had this really intense call where she heard Jesus' voice on a train on her way um, to do some charity work, and she called it a call within a call. Um, and it was the thorn in her flesh. Um, St. John of the Cross, for example, was kidnapped by his own brothers. It was the monks who jailed him and kept him up in the tower for about a year. And then he faced the Spanish Inquisition of all things. And it was during those intense um, moments of loneliness and betrayal that St. John found his own strength and to write one of the most iconic poems in literature. And then Heman the Ezrahite, right? It says in Psalm 88:15 that he was afflicted from his youth. And it leads biblical scholars to question what exactly was going on with him medically. What is kind of certain is that he had to be experiencing something that prevented him from entering the temple. And of course, in ancient times, and even today, um, people who are sick and unwell have always been ostracized in society. And
I would challenge the biblical version of that, but go ahead.
and yeah, I think those are the
Thanks. Thanks. Anybody else? Got one more minute? Well, thank you again, Cornelius, so much for sharing with us this wonderful work and tying it together with your own journey in a way that helps us to really relate deeply to the truths that you're drawing out from the scholarship. So we wish you all the best in your continuing doctoral studies. We can't wait to celebrate with you again as you receive a PhD degree. Got a little bit of work to do between now and then, but we're very excited that you shared this with us along the way. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's here sharing in it.